Two American fighter jets streaked across the Strait of Hormuz at dawn on Monday, May 25th, locked targeting systems onto a pair of Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats actively laying naval mines in one of the world's most critical shipping corridors, and fired. Minutes later, a surface-to-air missile battery near Bandar Abbas that had been tracking American aircraft was destroyed in a follow-on strike. By Tuesday morning, Iran's foreign ministry accused Washington of violating the ceasefire that had held since early April. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps warned that retaliation was legitimate and certain. In Doha, an Iranian negotiating team led by Foreign Affairs spokesman Esmail Bagay sat across from Qatari mediators attempting to finalize a deal that Secretary of State Marco Rubio claimed was just days away, down to disagreements over a word, a sentence. 800 miles to the west, Israeli ground forces crossed beyond the so-called Yellow Line in southern Lebanon for the first time since the April ceasefire took effect. The Israel Defense Forces struck more than 100 Hezbollah positions overnight across the Bekaa Valley in southern villages. 31 people were killed in a single day, the deadliest since April. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, testifying in his corruption trial in Jerusalem, left the courtroom early due to what his office called diplomatic obligations. Hours later, he authorized the military to deepen operations in Lebanon and ordered strikes intensified. By Tuesday evening, President Donald Trump was preparing to convene his full cabinet at Camp David on Wednesday, a rare off-site meeting scheduled at what officials described as a high-stakes moment for American strategy in the Middle East. These were not isolated incidents. They were the simultaneous resumption of military pressure on two active fronts, one in the Persian Gulf, the other in Lebanon, both unfolding while American diplomats worked to close a fragile deal with Tehran. What made May 25th and 26th significant was not simply that the United States struck Iranian military assets or that Israel expanded ground operations beyond agreed lines. It was that both actions occurred in the narrow space between a ceasefire that remained technically in effect and a diplomatic process that had not yet collapsed. The question facing American decision-makers was no longer whether the ceasefire would hold. It was whether the deal could survive the battlefield. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran had been in place for 6 weeks. Brokered by Pakistan and announced on April 8th, it followed the most intense phase of Operation Epic Fury. The American military campaign launched on February 28th, alongside Israeli strikes that killed Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei and targeted nuclear facilities, military command centers, and Revolutionary Guard infrastructure across the country. By early April, more than 3,400 Iranians had been killed, according to Iran's Ministry of Health. The human rights organization Henga estimated over 5,300 members of Iranian military forces dead. At least 50 senior Iranian officials and commanders had been eliminated in what amounted to the largest decapitation campaign in modern warfare. The ceasefire did not end hostilities. It paused the main bombing campaign. American naval forces maintained a blockade of Iranian ports. U.S. Central Command reported that by late May, American forces had redirected 100 commercial vessels away from Iranian waters, disabled 4 ships accused of violating blockade measures, and permitted only 26 humanitarian aid vessels to proceed. CENTCOM. Commander Admiral Brad Cooper described the mission as allowing zero trade into and out of Iranian ports, designed to squeeze Iran economically while negotiations proceeded. Iran, for its part, had declared the Strait of Hormuz closed on March 4th. On April 17th, Tehran announced the strait would remain open for the duration of the ceasefire. Oil prices dropped 11% that day, but the Revolutionary Guard redefined the Strait of Hormuz into what it called a vast operational area extending from the port city of Jask to Siri Island, a significant expansion of Iran's claimed jurisdiction beyond the traditional narrow corridor through which a fifth of the world's oil passes. Lebanon presented a different problem. A separate ceasefire brokered by the United States took effect on April 16th. It committed the Lebanese government to disarming Hezbollah and required Israeli forces to remain within a self-declared buffer zone in southern Lebanon. Under the terms negotiated by Washington, Israel retained the right to conduct what it classified as defensive operations. Hezbollah was not party to the agreement. The militant group rejected direct talks and insisted its weapons were not subject to negotiation. By May, the ceasefire had largely held in Beirut and areas away from the border. But in southern Lebanon, skirmishes continued. Hezbollah launched drone attacks on Israeli forces. Israel responded with airstrikes on weapons depots and observation posts. As of late May, at least 3,185 people had been killed in Lebanon since the war began. Hezbollah's internal sources reported over 1,000 fighters dead. Israel reported 11 soldiers and 1 civilian killed in attacks on forces in Lebanon and northern Israel. Both ceasefires rested on the assumption that military restraint would create space for diplomacy. Talks between American and Iranian negotiators, mediated by Qatar, focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, lifting aspects of the American blockade, addressing Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, and establishing a framework for ending the broader conflict within 60 days. Secretary Rubio, speaking from India on May 26th, told reporters a deal could be finalized in a couple of days. Iran disputed that timeline. Iranian negotiators in Doha described the talks as generally positive, but cautioned that no agreement was imminent. One of the principal sticking points remained Iran's uranium stockpile. The American position called for the material to either be transferred immediately or destroyed inside Iran under joint coordination with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Tehran had not agreed. The political stakes were clear. Trump faced midterm elections in 6 months. There was growing pressure on the White House to demonstrate results, either a diplomatic resolution or a definitive military outcome. For Israel, the Lebanon front remained unresolved. Hezbollah retained significant military capability despite Israeli strikes. Netanyahu faced domestic criticism that the ceasefire had allowed Hezbollah to regroup without achieving disarmament. For Iran, the economic cost of the blockade was mounting. The Revolutionary Guard retained operational capability, but the country's economy was under severe strain. The question was whether any party had sufficient incentive to de-escalate, or whether the logic of military pressure would override diplomatic caution. On the morning of May 25th, American intelligence detected 2 Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats operating in the Strait of Hormuz. According to a senior U.S. official, the vessels were actively laying naval mines, explosive devices designed to damage or sink ships passing through the waterway. The official described the activity as posing a direct risk to regional security and commercial navigation. Separately, a surface-to-air missile battery near the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas locked onto American aircraft conducting operations over southern Iran and nearby waters. U.S. officials said the system had tracked and targeted U.S. planes, though no aircraft were hit. The decision to strike was made quickly. U.S. Central Command authorized what it termed self-defense strikes. Navy Captain Tim Hawkins, a CENTCOM spokesperson, issued a statement. U.S. forces conducted self-defense strikes in southern Iran today to protect our troops from threats posed by Iranian forces. The operation targeted the 2 IRGC boats and destroyed the SAM site. Explosions were reported across multiple locations near the strait on Monday. Iranian media confirmed blasts in Bandar Abbas. Additional explosions were heard near Sirik and Jask along the southern coast. 2 U.S. officials later told NBC News that the strikes were in direct response to what they described as 24 hours of missile, drone, and small boat launches carried out by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps near the Strait of Hormuz. The IRGC had launched multiple surface-to-air missiles while U.S. aircraft were flying in the area. The officials emphasized no American aircraft were hit. A senior U.S. official later said the strikes were over for now. 2 additional sources told Fox News that the operation did not represent the end of the ceasefire with Iran, emphasizing that the strikes were limited in scope and intent. CENTCOM's public messaging stressed restraint. Captain Hawkins added, U.S. Central Command continues to defend our forces while using restraint during the ongoing ceasefire. The statement reflected a deliberate framing. These were not offensive operations designed to expand the conflict, but defensive actions taken in response to immediate threats. The legal framework invoked was self-defense under existing rules of engagement. American forces had been conducting armed patrols over the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz under what the military called Project Freedom, operations designed to secure maritime routes and escort commercial shipping. The presence of U.S. aircraft in Iranian airspace or near Iranian territory was not unusual in the context of the blockade and ongoing ceasefire monitoring. Iran's response came swiftly. By Tuesday morning, the Foreign Ministry accused the United States of a clear violation of the ceasefire. The ministry statement said the U.S. had continued unlawful and unjust actions since the ceasefire announcement and had committed numerous maritime robberies against Iranian commercial ships. It accused Washington of flagrantly violating the ceasefire in Iran's Hormozgan region over the past 28 hours. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a direct warning. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps warns against any violation of the ceasefire by the aggressive U.S. military and considers its right to reciprocal response to be legitimate and certain. The Iranian position was clear. From Tehran's perspective, the U.S. strikes were not defensive. They were offensive operations conducted against Iranian military assets inside Iranian territory during a ceasefire. The Revolutionary Guard claimed it would retaliate, citing what it described as encounters with U.S. drones and an F-35 jet. CENTCOM had not acknowledged any aircraft losses, though the IRGC separately claimed it had downed an MQ-9 Reaper drone. No photographs or debris had been released. If confirmed, the loss would add to the 24 Reapers already destroyed during Operation Epic Fury, according to a Congressional Research Service report published in March. The timing was critical. The strikes occurred as Iranian negotiators were gathering in Qatar. Esmail Baghai, Iran's foreign affairs spokesman and lead negotiator, was preparing to meet with Qatari mediators acting on behalf of the United States. Rubio's statement that a deal was days away came on the same day American aircraft struck Iranian assets. The gap between diplomatic optimism and battlefield action created immediate tension. If Iran chose to retaliate, whether through missile strikes, drone attacks, or renewed mine-laying operations, the ceasefire could collapse entirely. If Tehran chose restraint, it risked appearing weak domestically while conceding American military dominance in the Gulf. The Revolutionary Guard's public warning that retaliation was legitimate and certain suggested the decision had not yet been made, but the threat was real. While American forces were striking Iranian boats in the Strait of Hormuz, Israeli ground forces in southern Lebanon were preparing to cross a line drawn 6 weeks earlier. The April ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon included a provision that Israeli forces would remain within a designated buffer zone, a security corridor extending roughly 10 kilometers north of the Israeli border. The so-called Yellow Line marked the boundary Israeli troops were not supposed to cross without triggering a violation. By May, Hezbollah had resumed launching drone attacks on Israeli forces inside that buffer zone. A comprehensive analysis published in late May counted 252 Hezbollah explosive drone attacks over the previous 2 months. On Monday, May 25th, Hezbollah launched what the IDF described as a number of explosive drones toward Israeli soldiers and Israeli territory. Some of the drones landed inside Israel. No injuries were reported. Netanyahu convened a security consultation at the Kiryat military headquarters in Tel Aviv, alongside Defense Minister Israel Katz and IDF Chief of Staff Lieutenant General Eyal Zamir. The Israeli military had been conducting limited strikes in southern Lebanon throughout May, hitting weapons, storage facilities, command centers, and observation posts. But those operations had been constrained by the ceasefire framework and by American pressure to avoid escalation that could disrupt talks with Iran. At the May 25th meeting, Zamir reportedly told the cabinet that it is not possible to operate with tweezers. Senior officers argued the IDF's hands were tied and that it could not operate effectively beyond the Yellow Line due to ongoing negotiations with Washington. Netanyahu made the decision to expand operations. He left his corruption trial testimony in Jerusalem early on Tuesday due to what his office described as diplomatic obligations. By Tuesday afternoon, he released a video statement declaring that the IDF would intensify its strikes in Lebanon. "We must increase the blows, increase the intensity," Netanyahu said. "We will strike them decisively." The statement was directed at Hezbollah, but it also signaled to Washington that Israel intended to act regardless of American concerns about timing. The Israel Defense Forces struck more than 100 Hezbollah sites overnight on Monday into Tuesday. Targets included weapons storage facilities, command centers, and observation points across southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley. One strike hit the eastern village of Mashgara, killing 12 people, including several members of a single family, according to Lebanon's state-run national news agency. By Tuesday, Lebanon's health ministry reported that 31 people had been killed in Israeli airstrikes, the deadliest day since the ceasefire took effect in April. The IDF issued evacuation warnings for 13 towns and villages in southern Lebanon, ahead of additional strikes. On Tuesday, Israel confirmed that its forces had crossed beyond the Yellow Line. The IDF did not specify how far it would push into Lebanon, though officials indicated the incursions would be temporary and that the military was not seeking to hold additional territory. The stated objective was to push Hezbollah's drone launch teams farther from the border. But even within the Israeli military, there was disagreement about the operational logic. Multiple IDF officials failed to explain how pushing Hezbollah back from approximately 10 kilometers to 12 kilometers from Israel's border would prevent the group from launching drones with a 30-kilometer range. Some officers described Monday's strikes as mostly symbolic. The decision to expand operations came with American approval, but with conditions. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee briefed the White House on Monday night about Israel's intention to expand operations in Lebanon. According to a report from Israel's Channel 12, the American message in return was clear: not to bring down buildings in Beirut. A senior Israeli official later confirmed that Jerusalem had freedom of action in southern Lebanon, less so in Beirut. The distinction mattered. Washington was willing to tolerate Israeli operations against Hezbollah infrastructure in the south, where the ceasefire had already eroded. But strikes in the capital, particularly large-scale attacks on residential buildings, risked triggering a broader escalation that could derail the Iran negotiations entirely. Secretary of State Rubio, speaking from India on Tuesday, defended Israel's right to respond to Hezbollah attacks. If Hezbollah is firing missiles at Israel, and as it is doing so, Israel has every right to respond and prevent it from happening, Rubio said. That is the understanding under the current ceasefire in Lebanon, and it will remain the understanding going forward. A separate U.S. official told CNN that Israel will never be expected to passively absorb attacks on its forces and civilians. The statements reflected Washington's position that Israel retained the right to self-defense under the ceasefire framework, even if those defensive actions involved crossing previously agreed boundaries. Hezbollah did not issue a formal statement on Tuesday. But the group's actions suggested it had not been deterred. Drone attacks continued. The Israeli military reported intercepting additional drones targeting forces in the south. It remained unclear whether Hezbollah viewed the Israeli expansion as a fundamental violation of the ceasefire or as an expected response within the ongoing low-level conflict that had persisted since April. What was clear was that neither side had committed to full de-escalation. Hezbollah retained operational capability. Israel retained the willingness to strike. And the ceasefire, such as it was, existed only in the sense that neither side had resumed the full-scale bombing campaigns that preceded it. The connection between the American strikes in Iran and the Israeli expansion in Lebanon was not operational. U.S. and Israeli forces were not coordinating a simultaneous two-front offensive. The connection was strategic. Both actions occurred within the same 48-hour window. Both tested the boundaries of ceasefires that remained in effect but had grown increasingly fragile. And both were driven by the same underlying logic, that military pressure could be calibrated to deter adversaries without collapsing the diplomatic process entirely. For the United States, the decision to strike IRGC boats laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz was framed as a response to an immediate threat. But it also sent a signal. The ceasefire did not grant Iran freedom of action in the Gulf. American forces would continue to operate. The blockade would remain in place. And any Iranian activity deemed threatening to U.S. personnel or commercial shipping would be met with force. The fact that the strikes occurred as Iranian negotiators prepared to meet in Doha suggested Washington believed it could manage the escalation, that limited defensive strikes would not derail talks, and that Tehran would calculate that retaliation would cost more than restraint. For Israel, the decision to cross the yellow line in Lebanon was driven by different pressures. Netanyahu faced domestic criticism that the April ceasefire had failed to achieve its stated objective of disarming Hezbollah. Drone attacks on Israeli forces continued. Casualties were mounting. The IDF chief of staff was demanding greater freedom to operate. And Israeli officials were increasingly skeptical that American-led diplomacy with Iran would produce an outcome that addressed Hezbollah's presence in southern Lebanon. The decision to expand operations was a test of American tolerance. If Washington accepted Israeli strikes in the south while prohibiting operations in Beirut, Netanyahu had gained tactical flexibility without triggering a diplomatic break. If Washington pushed back harder, the Israeli position was that self-defense justified the escalation. The risk in both cases was the same. Neither the United States nor Israel controlled how their adversaries would respond. Iran's Revolutionary Guard had publicly warned that retaliation was coming, whether that meant renewed missile launches, additional mine-laying operations, drone strikes on U.S. bases in the region, or attacks on commercial shipping remained unclear. Hezbollah had demonstrated it could sustain drone campaigns against Israeli forces despite repeated airstrikes on its infrastructure. If either Iran or Hezbollah chose to escalate significantly, launching massed drone swarms, striking civilian targets, or conducting large-scale rocket barrages, the ceasefires would collapse. The diplomatic process in Doha would stall or end, and the United States and Israel would face the decision of whether to resume full offensive operations or accept that military pressure had reached its limit. What made the May 25th and 26th strikes particularly significant was not their scale. The U.S. operation was limited, 2 boats and a missile site. The Israeli strikes, while extensive, were concentrated in areas where the ceasefire had already eroded. What mattered was the timing. Both actions occurred at the moment when diplomatic momentum was supposedly building. Rubio had said a deal was days away. Iranian and American negotiators were actively engaged, and yet military operations continued. The message embedded in that contradiction was clear. Neither Washington nor Jerusalem believed diplomacy alone would resolve the conflict. Pressure, economic, military, and strategic, would continue until an agreement was signed. And even then, enforcement would depend on the credible threat of renewed strikes. The first critical decision was made by IRGC commanders who resumed mine-laying operations in the Strait of Hormuz. That decision, whether authorized by senior leadership in Tehran or taken by local commanders, triggered the American response. The second was the decision by CENTCOM to strike immediately rather than issue warnings or pursue diplomatic channels to de-escalate. That choice reflected a U.S. calculus that deterrence required visible, rapid action. The third was the decision by Netanyahu to authorize the IDF to cross the yellow line in Lebanon. That decision was driven by domestic political pressure, military advice that limited strikes were ineffective, and a belief that Washington would tolerate the escalation. The fourth was the decision by Hezbollah to continue drone attacks, despite knowing they would provoke Israeli retaliation. That choice reflected the group's assessment that it could sustain losses without compromising its long-term position. But the most consequential decision may have been the one not yet made. By Tuesday evening, Iran had accused the United States of violating the ceasefire and threatened retaliation. The Revolutionary Guard had issued a public warning, but no retaliation had occurred. Iranian negotiators remained in Doha. Talks were continuing. The question was whether Tehran would prioritize the diplomatic process or respond militarily to what it described as American aggression. That decision would determine whether the ceasefire survived the week. A similar calculation faced Hezbollah. The group had sustained significant losses in the Israeli strikes overnight. 31 people were dead. Weapons depots and command centers had been destroyed. Israeli forces were operating beyond the agreed line. Hezbollah could launch a major rocket barrage into northern Israel, triggering a full Israeli ground invasion and the collapse of the ceasefire. Or it could continue limited drone attacks, accepting tactical losses while preserving strategic capability for a future escalation. The choice would shape whether Lebanon remained a contained theater or became the spark for a wider regional war. For the United States, the turning point was the Camp David meeting scheduled for Wednesday. Trump was convening his full cabinet at a moment when both Iran and Lebanon fronts were active. The rare off-site meeting suggested the administration was preparing to make major decisions, either to push harder for a diplomatic resolution with Iran, to authorize expanded military operations, or to fundamentally reassess American strategy in the Middle East. What made the meeting significant was its timing. It came after American forces had struck Iran, after Israel had expanded operations in Lebanon, and after Iran had threatened retaliation. The decisions made at Camp David would determine whether Washington doubled down on military pressure, pulled back to preserve the diplomatic track, or attempted to manage both simultaneously. The hidden factor shaping all of these decisions was the timeline. Rubio had said a deal could be finalized in days. Negotiations were down to disputes over language, but the closer the talks came to a potential agreement, the greater the incentive for each side to demonstrate strength. Iran wanted to show it had not been forced into submission. The United States wanted to show the blockade and strikes had produced leverage. Israel wanted to show it retained freedom of action regardless of American diplomacy. And Hezbollah wanted to show it had not been disarmed or deterred. The result was a compression of military activity into the narrow window when diplomacy was supposedly advancing. Each side was attempting to shape the final terms of any agreement by demonstrating what it could do if the agreement failed. The problem with that logic was simple. At some point, the escalation designed to strengthen a negotiating position could destroy the negotiation itself. If Iran retaliated for the May 25th strikes, the United States would respond. If Hezbollah launched a major attack, Israel would invade. And the diplomatic process in Doha, fragile, incomplete, and dependent on mutual restraint, would collapse. The question was whether any of the actors involved recognized the risk in time to step back, or whether the momentum of military escalation would override diplomatic caution. What happened on May 25th and 26th matters, because it reveals the fragility of ceasefires negotiated during unfinished wars. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran was not a peace agreement. It was a pause in hostilities that allowed both sides to negotiate while maintaining military pressure. The ceasefire in Lebanon was not a resolution of the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. It was an agreement to limit operations in certain areas while permitting continued strikes under the banner of self-defense. Both ceasefires existed because neither side had achieved a decisive military victory, and because the costs of continued full-scale war outweighed the benefits. But they were not built on trust or mutual disarmament. They were built on the assumption that military pressure could be calibrated, that strikes could be limited, retaliation could be controlled, and escalation could be managed. The events of those 2 days tested that assumption. The United States struck Iranian boats laying mines and destroyed a missile site. Iran accused Washington of violating the ceasefire and threatened retaliation. Israel crossed the yellow line in Lebanon and struck over 100 Hezbollah positions. 31 people were killed. Hezbollah continued drone attacks, and American, Iranian, and Israeli decision-makers all claimed their actions were defensive, proportional, and consistent with the terms of agreements that were increasingly difficult to define. For Americans, the significance of this moment lies in what it reveals about the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. The United States launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, with the stated aim of creating conditions for regime change in Iran. 82 days later, the Iranian government remained in place. A new supreme leader had been installed. The Revolutionary Guard retained operational capability, and American forces were conducting limited strikes in the Strait of Hormuz, while negotiators in Doha attempted to finalize a deal that would reopen shipping lanes and address Iran's nuclear program. The war had not produced regime change. It had produced a ceasefire that depended on continued American military presence, economic pressure, and the threat of renewed strikes. The question was whether that ceasefire was sustainable or whether it was simply a temporary pause before the next phase of conflict. The same question applied to Lebanon. Israel had conducted thousands of airstrikes since the war began. It had killed over 1,000 Hezbollah fighters, according to the group's internal sources. It had destroyed weapons depots, command centers, and infrastructure. And yet Hezbollah retained the capability to launch 252 drone attacks over 2 months, to kill Israeli soldiers, and to sustain operations despite Israeli ground incursions. The ceasefire had not disarmed Hezbollah. It had reduced the intensity of fighting while preserving the group's strategic position. Netanyahu's decision to expand operations beyond the Yellow Line was an acknowledgement that the ceasefire had not achieved its objectives and that military pressure would continue indefinitely. What this means for American foreign policy is that the United States is managing two active conflicts, one with Iran, one between its ally Israel and an Iranian-backed militia, without a clear path to resolution. The diplomatic process in Doha offers the possibility of an agreement that could end the Iran conflict, reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and address nuclear concerns. But that process is fragile, dependent on mutual restraint that is eroding, and vulnerable to disruption by military actions on either side. The Lebanon ceasefire offers the possibility of reduced violence and eventual Hezbollah disarmament. But that outcome depends on Lebanese government capacity that does not exist, Hezbollah willingness that has not materialized, and Israeli acceptance of a timeline that Netanyahu has rejected. The deeper issue is the assumption embedded in both ceasefires, that military pressure can be sustained indefinitely without triggering full escalation, and that adversaries will accept terms negotiated under duress without seeking opportunities to retaliate. That assumption worked for 6 weeks. It allowed diplomats to meet in Doha. It allowed shipping to resume in the Strait of Hormuz. It allowed civilian casualties in Lebanon to decline, but it did not resolve the underlying conflicts. It postponed them. And the events of May 25th and 26th suggest that postponement may be ending. By Wednesday morning, the situation remained unresolved. Iran had threatened retaliation, but had not acted. Hezbollah had sustained losses, but continued drone operations. Israeli forces remained beyond the Yellow Line in Lebanon. American negotiators were preparing for additional talks in Doha, and President Trump was gathering his cabinet at Camp David to assess American strategy at a moment when both fronts were active and both ceasefires were under strain. The next 48 hours would be critical. If Iran chose not to retaliate for the May 25th strikes, it would signal Tehran's priority was preserving the diplomatic process. If Iran launched missiles, drones, or additional mine-laying operations, the ceasefire would collapse and American forces would strike again. If Hezbollah launched a major attack, Israel would invade southern Lebanon, and the April ceasefire would end. If neither Iran nor Hezbollah escalated, the fragile status quo would hold, at least temporarily. The ceasefires negotiated in April were never designed to end the conflicts. They were designed to manage them. The United States and Israel retain the military capability to strike Iranian and Hezbollah targets at will. Iran and Hezbollah retain the capability to launch drones, missiles, and asymmetric attacks. Neither side has disarmed. Neither side has conceded, and neither side has achieved its strategic objectives. The question is not whether the ceasefires will hold indefinitely. The question is whether they will hold long enough for diplomacy to produce an alternative to renewed war. The events of May 25th and 26th do not answer that question. They reveal the tension embedded in the attempt. Two theaters of conflict, two fragile ceasefires, two sets of adversaries testing boundaries, and one diplomatic process trying to hold together under the weight of military pressure that never stopped. The outcome will depend on decisions not yet made by leaders in Tehran, Jerusalem, Beirut, and Washington about whether restraint serves their interests better than retaliation, and whether the risk of collapse is worth the potential gain of escalation. For now, the answer remains uncertain, and that uncertainty is the most dangerous element of all.